After you have eaten, you begin to gather your working tools from their places around the room, each object found by touch and habit in the dim light. You pick up a flat grinding stone of grey diorite, smooth on one side from years of use, and wrap it in a piece of soft leather to protect your linen bag. Beside it you place a small oval handstone that fits perfectly in your palm, its surface worn to a gentle curve. You then reach for your palette, an old potsherd with a shallow depression in the center that you have scrubbed clean the evening before, and you tuck it carefully against the grinding slab. A few stoppered pots of raw mineral are lined up on a low shelf. You select the ones that hold chunks of deep red hematite and golden limonite, each pot sealed with a plug of twisted linen, and you add them to the bag along with a tightly rolled bundle of reed brushes. The brushes are slender stems chewed at the end into soft, fibrous tips, and you check that the finest one, used for outlines, is protected inside a hollow piece of dried reed. You also slip in a small clay bowl that fits neatly into the curve of the palette, a stoppered flask of gum arabic solution, and a clean linen cloth for wiping your hands. Everything goes into a sturdy linen sack that has 2 long straps, and you swing it over one shoulder, feeling its familiar weight settle across your back. The house is still quiet. No sound but the faint rustle of your own movements and the distant, almost imaginary call of a night bird from the desert beyond the village. You push open the low wooden door and step outside into the pale starlight, closing the door softly behind you so as not to wake the neighbors whose houses stand close together along the narrow street. The air outside is cooler than inside, a thin, dry coolness that carries the smell of sun-baked dust and the faint mineral tang of the limestone cliffs that ring the village. Above you, the sky is a vast dome of deep indigo, scattered with countless stars that shine without flickering, and a thin crescent moon hangs low over the western peaks, its light just enough to show the edges of the path. The village around you is utterly still. No lamps burn in any window. No voices carry on the air, and even the dogs that roam the lanes are silent, curled up in the warm dust of the doorways. You pause for a moment in the street, letting the deep quiet of the hour settle into your thoughts, and then you begin to walk. Your sandals, made of braided papyrus, make a soft, regular sound on the packed earth, a light scuff followed by a whisper of dust, a rhythm so steady that it soon fades from your attention, becoming part of the background silence like a heartbeat. You leave the village by the northern path, where the houses thin out and the cultivated fields give way to open desert. The track ahead is a pale ribbon of trodden earth and crushed limestone, just wide enough for a single donkey cart, and it winds gently between low mounds of rubble and scattered thorn bushes whose dark shapes are barely visible against the ground. On either side the desert stretches away into formless shadow, an empty plain of sand and pebbles that holds no movement except the occasional rustle of a small nocturnal creature retreating from your steps. You walk without haste, each footfall landing naturally on the surface that you have walked hundreds of times before, and your body knows every slight rise and dip of the path even in darkness. After a few minutes the ground begins to slope gradually upward, and the limestone cliffs of the Theban hills rise before you like a wall of solid shadow cut against the starry sky, their surfaces appearing first as a dark mass, then slowly revealing pale streaks of vertical cracking as your eyes adjust to the faint light. The track enters a winding, narrow canyon that leads toward the Valley of the Kings, and the high walls on either side close in, cutting off the wide view of the desert and replacing it with a sense of contained stillness, as if the very stone is holding its breath. Inside the canyon, the darkness is deeper because the starlight cannot reach directly to the floor of the path, but enough reflected light bounces from the cliff faces to keep the way visible. You notice the change in sound immediately. Your sandals now make a slightly sharper sound against the loose pebbles, and the soft echo of each step returns to you from the rock walls with a tiny delay, so that you seem to be accompanied by a faint, gentle double of your own footsteps. You pass a large fallen boulder that you remember from countless mornings, its surface weathered into smooth hollows, and you reach out a hand to touch it as you go by, feeling the coolness of the stone that holds the night's chill deep inside its mass. A little further along, a narrow cleft in the cliff to your right opens onto a side valley, and from that direction comes the distant, liquid call of a mourning dove, a single low note that repeats twice and then fades into the silence. You listen without breaking step, and the sound seems to belong perfectly to the hour, a soft punctuation that marks the slow passage of time before dawn. As you continue, the sky above the canyon rim begins to change. The deep indigo that filled the entire dome of night now retreats toward the west, while above the eastern cliffs a faint grey light seeps upward like water soaking into a cloth, diluting the blackness degree by degree. There is no sudden moment of transition, only a gradual, almost imperceptible lifting of the dark, so that you realize after a while that you can now make out individual details on the rock walls that were invisible before. A vein of white quartz running diagonally through the limestone, a patch of darker mineral staining, the tiny holes bored by ancient insects into the softer layers. The stars remain overhead for a while, but one by one the faintest of them disappear, swallowed by the growing light, until only a few bright points remain near the zenith, and even they look dimmer, as if they are receding into a vast distance. The crescent moon, which was low in the west when you left the village, has now sunk behind the ridge, leaving no trace, and the sky above the eastern cliffs has paled to the colour of a dove's breast, a soft pearl grey that holds no warmth yet but promises the coming day. You pause for a moment where the path levels out slightly, adjusting the strap of your linen bag on your shoulder, and you turn your head to look back the way you have come. The valley floor below is still a sea of shadow, but you can see the faint outline of the village as a cluster of darker shapes against the pale desert, and beyond it the thin silver line of the Nile reflects the first hint of light from the east. From this distance the river seems perfectly still, a ribbon of mercury laid across the dark land, and you can trace its course northward until it disappears behind a fold of hills. You take a slow breath of the clean, dry air, tasting the slight saltiness of desert dust on your tongue, and then you turn back to the path and resume walking, your pace unchanged, your mind quiet and uncluttered by any thought that presses for attention. The walking itself has become a gentle, rhythmic activity that requires no effort, and you let your attention rest on the simple sensations of the moment, the feel of the sandal straps between your toes, the coolness of the air on your cheeks, the regular sight of the path unrolling before you in the dim light. The canyon continues to narrow for a short distance, and then it opens out into a wider, bowl-shaped amphitheater of cliffs that marks the outer entrance to the Valley of the Kings. Here the ground is more level, covered in a fine, pale sand that has washed down from the surrounding slopes over countless centuries, and your footsteps become quieter, a soft shuffling sound that barely disturbs the silence. A few scattered acacia trees grow in this wider space, their thorny branches black and intricate against the brightening sky, and you notice a small flock of sandgrouse rise from the ground further up the valley, their wings making a thin whistling sound as they fly in a tight formation toward the river. The eastern rim of the amphitheater is now clearly defined against the sky, and a thin band of gold is beginning to appear along the very edge of the rock, so bright that you cannot look at it directly. The gold intensifies slowly, creeping downward along the ridges and fissures of the limestone, and where it touches the darker stone it creates long, stark shadows that stretch toward you across the sand. You stop for a final time at a flat rock that serves as a resting place for the workers who walk this path, setting down your linen bag and rolling your shoulders once to loosen the muscles that have grown slightly stiff from the walk. The sun itself is not yet visible, but the light pouring over the cliff edge is already warm enough to feel on your face when you turn toward it, a gentle heat that contrasts with the lingering coolness of the night air in the valley bottom. You close your eyes for a few moments, letting the red glow filter through your eyelids, and you listen to the complete, profound silence of the valley, a silence so deep that you can hear the faint rushing of your own blood in your ears. No bird calls now, no wind stirs, and the world seems suspended in a perfect pause between night and day. When you open your eyes again, the golden band has widened into a soft blaze that washes the entire eastern cliff face in warm amber light, and the shadows that stretch toward you have shortened and shifted as the sun climbs higher behind the ridge. You pick up your bag and continue the last portion of the walk, skirting around a large spoil heap of white limestone chips that glint in the new sunlight, the fragments of stone left by generations of tomb cutters who excavated the royal tombs deeper in the valley. The path here becomes slightly steeper again, winding between great heaps of debris that flank the approach to the main burial grounds, and you notice the first small tomb entrances cut into the lower cliffs, rectangular doorways framed by simple stone lintels, some sealed with stones and plaster, and others with simple wooden doors, like the one you will open today. The door of the tomb where you are working is set into the base of a tall cliff at the far end of the valley branch, a small, unremarkable opening that reveals nothing of the chambers within. You approach it with the same quiet regularity with which you do everything, untying the simple rope that secures the wooden door, and you pause with your hand resting on the rough surface of the wood. Through the thin gap between the planks you can feel the cooler air of the interior seeping out, a constant dry exhalation that smells of ancient stone and fine dust. The sun is now fully above the cliff edge, and the valley around you is flooded with the pale golden light of early morning, a light so clear and sharp that every pebble on the ground casts its own tiny shadow. You stand there for a long, quiet moment, your linen bag on your shoulder, your hand on the door, and you let the peace of the dawn, the silence of the cliffs, and the simple completeness of this ordinary beginning settle deep into your chest before you push the door open and step inside to meet the day's slow work. You push the wooden door open with both hands, and it swings inward without a sound, moving smoothly on its simple rope hinges, the gap widening to reveal a darkness that is deep and dry and perfectly still. For a moment you stand on the threshold, letting your eyes adjust from the bright morning glare of the valley to the interior gloom, and you notice how the air from inside the tomb pours out gently against your shins, as if the mountain itself is breathing a long, slow, cool exhalation. You step over the low stone threshold, 1 foot and then the other, and immediately the temperature drops by many degrees, the dry chill settling against your bare arms and the back of your neck, a sensation that is refreshing rather than uncomfortable. Inside, the darkness is not absolute. A diffuse grey light from the open doorway pushes in a few cubits, enough to show you the rough-hewn floor of pale limestone and the beginning of the first chamber's walls. You step aside so that the doorway light can fall deeper into the space, and you reach into your linen bag to find the clay lamp that you stored there the day before. Its shallow bowl still holding a small pool of linseed oil and the twisted flax wick that lies curled against the rim. You also retrieve a small clay bottle containing a little more oil and a flint striker wrapped in a scrap of leather, each item placed where your fingers expect to find it. You crouch near the entrance where the light is best, setting the lamp on the floor, and you pour a thin stream of oil from the bottle into the bowl until the wick is half submerged. The oil has a faint greenish scent, a little like crushed seeds, and it moves slowly in the cool air, reluctant to spread. You take the flint striker and a piece of worn iron, and you strike them together near the wick, producing a few brief sparks that fall onto the twisted flax. One spark catches, and a tiny orange flame blooms with a small steady glow that hardly flickers in the motionless air. You cup your hand around the flame for a moment to shelter it, though there is no wind, and then you let it settle into its own quiet burning, a single point of warm light that pushes back the darkness by an arm's length in every direction. You stand, lifting the lamp carefully, and you turn to look deeper into the tomb. The light moves with you, sliding over the surfaces of the walls, and you begin to see the room take shape. The chamber is a rectangle cut into the living rock, its walls roughly squared, and then plastered with a mixture of gypsum and fine sand, creating a surface that is smooth and pale, the color of old bone. The ceiling is slightly higher than a man can reach, flat and even, and it disappears into shadow. The floor underfoot is packed earth, mixed with limestone chippings, swept clean, and it slopes very gently downward as the tomb extends into the hill. You walk a little further in, holding the lamp ahead of you, and you pause where a small niche has been carved into the left-hand wall at about chest height. This niche is meant to hold a lamp, and it already contains a dried smear of old soot from previous days. You set your lit lamp into this niche, the flame now standing at a comfortable height to illuminate the entire front half of the chamber, and you turn back toward the door to retrieve a second lamp from your bag. You light the second lamp from the flame of the first, pressing the new wick against the old fire until it catches, and then you carry this second light deeper into the chamber, placing it in another niche on the right-hand wall, a little further in. Now the chamber begins to glow with a soft, wavering orange light that touches every surface, the two flames working together to push the darkness back into the far corners and into the tunnel that leads to the inner chambers. The light reveals the walls fully, and you stand for a long moment, simply looking. The walls around you are partly filled with unfinished scenes. To your left, a large panel shows the beginning of a funerary procession, drawn in thin red outlines that are crisp and confident. The figures are arranged in a horizontal register, their bodies proportioned according to the traditional grid, with shoulders presented frontally and heads in profile. Some of the figures have been filled in with flat fields of red ochre and white gypsum, but many remain only outlines, their empty interiors waiting for color. To your right, the wall shows a scene of the deceased king making an offering to a seated god. The god's throne outlined and partly painted in blue, the offering table sketched with charcoal that has smudged slightly in a few places from a hand that brushed against it long ago. Further along, near the back of the chamber, a large unfinished area of plaster has been prepared, but not yet drawn on at all. It is a blank, creamy white field, as smooth as paper, waiting silently for the grid lines and the first charcoal marks. The sight of these incomplete walls fills you with no sense of urgency, only a quiet recognition of the work that lies ahead, a work that will unfold in its own time, day by day, exactly as it did yesterday, and will again tomorrow. You return to the entrance and bring your linen bag fully inside, setting it down near the first lamp niche where the light is brightest. You kneel on the packed earth floor and begin to unpack your tools, one by one, arranging them around you in a semicircle, with the same care that a scribe might arrange his palette and inks. First, you take out the bundle of reed brushes, untie the string that holds them, and lay them out on a clean cloth spread on the floor. The brushes are of different sizes, from the very finest, which is no thicker than a barley stem and has a tip as pointed as a thorn, to the broadest, which is as wide as your thumb and made from a split reed pressed flat. Each brush is inspected quickly under the lamplight. You turn them over in your fingers, checking that the chewed fiber tips have not frayed or dried into a hard point, and you set aside one brush that needs to be rechewed, placing it in a small bowl of water from your leather bottle, so that the fibers can soften while you work on other things. Next you lift out the grinding slab and the handstone, setting them on a flat rock that serves as a low workbench just inside the entrance. The slab is a rectangle of diorite, dark grey speckled with lighter crystals, and its upper surface is worn perfectly smooth from years of grinding pigment. The handstone is oval, fitting comfortably into your palm, and its underside is polished to a dull gloss. You also place your palette, the old potsherd, beside the grinding slab, and you arrange the stoppered pots of raw mineral in a neat row, the pot of hematite for red, the pot of limonite for yellow, a small leather pouch of crushed charcoal for black, and a pot of the manufactured blue frit that will later be ground into Egyptian blue. Each container is sealed with a plug of linen, and you unstop them one by one, setting the plugs aside on a small piece of leather so that they do not pick up dust from the floor. The air inside the tomb is so dry that even the simple act of opening a pot releases a faint puff of mineral dust that hangs in the lamplight for a moment before settling. You notice how the dust motes drift slowly, suspended in the stillness, catching the orange glow, and then disappearing as they fall to the floor. The silence inside the tomb is different from the silence outside. It is a deeper, older silence, a presence rather than an absence, and it seems to press gently against your ears like the quiet that follows a distant sound. You can hear the very faint, almost imagined murmur of the lamp flames as they consume the oil, and now and then a tiny crackle from the wick as a fiber burns. Otherwise there is nothing, no wind, no bird, no distant voice, only the sound of your own slow breathing and the soft rustle of your linen kilt as you move. With your tools unpacked and arranged, you now prepare a small workspace directly beneath the first lamp. You place the low wooden stool that you keep inside the tomb near the grinding slab, and you sit down on it, testing its stability on the packed floor. The stool is a simple construction of 3 wooden legs fitted into a curved seat, and it creaks once, softly, as it takes your weight before settling into stillness. You pour a small amount of water from your leather bottle into the shallow clay bowl, enough to wet your brushes and to mix with the ground pigments later. The water in the bottle is still cool from the night, and it beads on the rim of the bowl as you pour, the droplets catching the light like tiny glass beads. You dip your fingers into the bowl and rub them together to remove any dust, then dry them on the cloth that lies across your knee. Everything is ready, and you pause for a moment to survey your small domain, the lamps burning steadily, the tools waiting in their places, the walls half-painted and patient, the darkness at the back of the chamber holding its peace. There is no clock here, no shadow moving across a dial to mark the hours, only the slow burning of the oil in the lamps and the gradual, imperceptible warming of the air as the sun climbs higher outside the tomb. Before you begin the day's grinding, you take a slow walk through the chamber with one of the lamps in your hand, inspecting the walls more closely. You move along the left wall first, holding the lamp so that the light falls at a shallow angle across the painted surfaces, and this raking light reveals every small irregularity in the plaster, a slight ripple where the trowel paused, a brush hair embedded in the paint from a previous session, a faint fingerprint left by a plasterer who worked on this wall long before you arrived. The red outlines of the figures seem to float slightly above the white ground, their edges crisp and well defined, and you trace the contour of a shoulder with your eye, following the line as it curves down into an arm and then bends at the elbow. The paint here is completely dry, and when you press a fingertip gently against it, nothing comes away. The color has become part of the plaster itself, bound into its crystalline structure by the slow, patient chemistry of drying. You move to the right wall and repeat the inspection, noting a small area where the whitewash has flaked away, revealing the grayish plaster beneath, a defect that you will repair later with a fresh wash of gypsum. You also check the charcoal sketch on the back wall, blowing very gently across its surface to remove any loose dust, the black particles scattering and disappearing into the gloom. The sketch shows the beginning of a register of hieroglyphs, the owl and the reed leaf and the seated man drawn with quick, sure strokes, and you count the columns quietly to yourself, verifying that the spacing follows the grid that you snapped onto the plaster the week before. Satisfied with your inspection, you return to your stool and sit down again, this time pulling the grinding slab closer until it rests securely on the folded cloth that prevents it from slipping. The lamp beside you was burned down a little, and you top it up with a few more drops of oil from the clay bottle before adjusting the wick with a splinter of reed, pulling it slightly higher so that the flame brightens. The light now falls directly onto the grinding area, illuminating every grain of stone on the diorite slab. You select a piece of raw hematite from the unstopped pot, a dark, heavy chunk with a rough, metallic-looking surface that glints dully when you tilt it in the light. You place it in the center of the slab and pick up the handstone, settling it into your right palm, feeling the familiar, cool weight and the smooth curve against your skin. Then you pause once more, not out of hesitation, but out of a quiet, deliberate habit, a moment of stillness before the long, repetitive work begins. Around you, the tomb holds its silence. The two flames burn without sound. The painted gods and goddesses on the walls watch with their flat, serene eyes, and the great mass of the mountain above presses down in perfect, weightless darkness. You lower the handstone onto the hematite, and you begin to grind. The handstone descends onto the chunk of hematite with a soft, precise pressure, and the first contact produces a small crunching sound that seems loud in the silence of the tomb, a crisp fracture of brittle mineral breaking into smaller fragments. You lift the stone slightly, reposition it, and press down again, this time with a gentle rotating motion that grinds the broken pieces against the diorite slab. The sound changes from a crunch to a gritty rasp, stone against stone, a low and steady noise that fills the small circle of lamplight around your hands. You settle into a slow rhythm. Press and rotate, the handstone traveling in a small oval path across the slab as the hematite fragments are crushed beneath it. The work is entirely repetitive, a cycle of pressure and movement that asks nothing of your mind except a quiet attention to the feeling in your palm and the changing texture under the stone. After a dozen rotations, you pause and lift the hamstone away, tilting the slab toward the lamp so that the light falls across the scattered powder. The first pass has reduced the dark chunk into a mixture of coarse, angular grains and finer dust, all of it a deep brownish red that looks almost black in the shadows. Use a small brush made from a palm fiber to sweep the powder into a loose pile at the center of the slab, gathering every grain with careful, unhurried strokes, and then you examine the pile closely, leaning forward until your face is just above the pigment. The coarse grains glint slightly, their surfaces faceted where the stone fractured them, and among them are tiny specks of a paler impurity, probably silica, that you will need to remove later. You take a deep, slow breath, the air tasting of dry mineral and lamp oil, and then you place the handstone back onto the pile and resume grinding. The second grinding is slower than the first because the fragments are already broken down and now need to be reduced to a finer consistency. You apply a lighter pressure this time, letting the weight of the stone do much of the work, and you move it in a wider circle that spreads the powder thinly across the slab. The sound is softer now, a whispering hiss rather than a rasp, the particles sliding over one another and over the polished diorite with a friction that is almost liquid. As you grind, you notice how the color of the powder begins to change. What was a dull, dark brown now lightens into a warmer tone, a true red emerging as the grains become smaller and their collective surface area increases. The lamplight catches this transformation, and you pause occasionally to tilt the slab and observe the hue, comparing it to the remembered shade of the finished paint that you have used on the walls around you. The red is not yet deep enough, the grind not fine enough, and so you continue, the circles of your hand growing smaller and more precise as the powder becomes a fine dust that clings slightly to the stone. Time passes inside this small circular motion, and you were aware of it only in the gradual changes in your body, a slight stiffness developing in your right shoulder from the repetitive movement, a warmth in your palm where it holds the stone, a dryness in your throat from the mineral dust that hangs faintly in the air. You stop to take a sip of water from the leather bottle, the liquid cool and slightly leathery in taste, and you pour a few drops onto the grinding slab to settle the dust before wiping the surface clean with a damp cloth. The cloth comes away stained a pale pink, and you fold it carefully, setting it aside to dry. The handstone is also wiped clean, its smooth underside now showing a faint reddish bloom where the hematite has embedded itself into the microscopic pores of the stone, a permanent record of all the grinding sessions that have come before this one. You return the clean slab to its position and select another piece of hematite from the pot, this one slightly larger and more irregular in shape. its surface covered in small cavities and crystalline protrusions. This piece will behave differently under the stone, and you anticipate the way it will fracture, the sound it will make, the time it will take to reduce it. You place it on the slab and bring the hand stone down, and the first crack is louder than before, a sharp pop that echoes faintly from the back of the chamber. A fragment skitters away across the slab, and you retrieve it with a fingertip, returning it to the center before continuing. The grinding of this second piece follows the same sequence: the initial crushing into coarse grains, the gathering into a pile, the finer grinding that reduces the grains to powder, the spreading and regathering, the gradual lightening of the color as the particles diminish. You work through the entire pot of raw hematite in this way, piece by piece, until the slab holds a mound of dark red powder, the size of a small fist, its surface velvety and even, its color, the deep, warm red of dried blood, or the heart of a pomegranate. Now comes the sifting, a process that will separate the finest particles from any remaining coarse grains that would mar the smoothness of the paint. You take a square of fine linen cloth, well washed and softened by many uses, and you stretch it over the rim of a clean clay bowl, securing it with a loop of twisted flax string. The cloth is so finely woven that when you hold it up to the lamp, the light passes through it only as a diffuse glow, the individual threads too small to count. You place the bowl on the floor between your feet, and using the palm fiber brush, you carefully transfer half of the ground pigment onto the stretched cloth. The powder sits on the linen in a small dark mound, and you begin to shake the bowl gently from side to side, a soft, rhythmic motion that makes the finest particles drift down through the weave like red smoke, falling silently into the bowl below. The coarser grains remain on top of the cloth, rolling and tumbling with each shake, and you watch them gather at the edges, a ring of tiny dark pebbles that the linen has refused to let pass. You shake for a long time until no more fine dust falls through, and then you tip the remaining coarse grains back onto the grinding slab, adding them to the pile of material that will be reground in the next pass. You repeat this sifting with the rest of the powder, working patiently through the entire mound, and the bowl slowly fills with a pigment that is as fine as flour, so soft and light that a breath would send it swirling into the air. You dip the tip of your little finger into the bowl and withdraw it, examining the way the red dust coats the skin in a thin, even layer, the color now exactly the shade that you require. This is the true red ochre, the color that will become the skin of gods and the borders of sacred scenes, the color of life and protection and the rising sun. You set the bowl aside on a flat stone, covering it with an upturned pot lid to keep the pigment clean, and you turn your attention back to the coarse grains that remain on the slab. The regrinding of the coarse residue is a slower process still, because these grains are the hardest fragments, the cores of the original chunks that resisted the first passes of the hand stone. You gather them into a tight pile and begin grinding again, using a firmer pressure and a smaller, more concentrated motion, working the stone over the grains until they crack and split and finally yield. The sound of this regrinding is sharper, more insistent, a scritching noise that rises and falls as the grains shift under the stone, and you feel the vibration of each fracture through the handle of the stone and into the bones of your wrist. You pause often to sweep the slab and check the consistency, and each time you return a few of the most stubborn grains to the center, grinding them again until nothing remains but fine red dust. When at last the entire batch of hematite has been reduced to a uniform silky powder, you add it to the bowl with the rest, and the total amount of pigment is a satisfying weight, perhaps enough to fill a small hen's egg, enough for several days of painting on the wall. You stretch your arms now, interlacing your fingers and pushing your palms away from your body, feeling the pleasant ache of used muscles in your shoulders and upper back. The stool creaks again as you shift your weight, and you stand for a moment, walking a few steps to the doorway to look out at the valley. The sun is higher now, the shadows shorter and sharper, and the heat of the day is beginning to build, even though the air inside the tomb remains cool. A lizard darts across a sunlit rock near the entrance, its small feet making no sound, and you watch it disappear into a crack before turning back to the lamplit chamber. The two flames have burned down a little more, and you add oil to each lamp, the liquid glugging softly from the clay bottle, the wicks drinking it in with a faint hiss as the oil reaches the fire. The lamps brighten again, and you return to your stool, ready for the next stage of the work. You now take the bowl of sifted red ochre and tip a small amount onto the clean grinding slab, spreading it out with a fingertip into a thin, even layer. You examine it closely one more time, your face close to the slab, and you notice a few remaining specks of a darker impurity, probably an oxidized iron or a fragment of the host rock that carried the hematite. You remove these with the tip of a fine brush, one by one, flicking them onto the floor where they disappear into the packed earth. The pigment is now as pure as you can make it, a uniform red of exactly the right depth and warmth, and you sit back on your stool looking at the small pile of color that you have created from a few rough dark stones. The transformation feels ordinary because you've done it so many times before, but it also holds a quiet completeness, a small cycle of effort and result that has filled the first portion of the day. You rest your hands on your knees and let your eyes travel around the chamber once more, from the painted walls to the blank plaster, from the burning lamps to the tools laid out on the cloth, and you feel the deep stillness of the tomb settle around you like a second skin. The red ochre waits in its bowl, as patient as the stone, and you wait with it, breathing slowly, listening to the silence, gathering yourself for the next slow step of the work. With the bowl of sifted red ochre sitting ready at your elbow, you now turn your attention to the substances that will transform this fine, dry dust into a smooth, workable paint. The process of binding is as old as the craft itself, passed down through generations of painters who worked in these same hills, and you approach it with the same patient care that you gave to the grinding. From your linen bag you retrieve a small stoppered flask that holds a solution of gum arabic, prepared by you several days earlier in your house and brought to the tomb each morning. The flask is made of a pale, unglazed clay, its surface cool and slightly rough against your fingers, and you unstop the linen plug with a gentle twist, setting the stopper aside on the leather scrap where the other plugs rest. You hold the flask near the lamp and tilt it slightly, observing the way the liquid moves within. It is thicker than water, a pale amber color, and it catches the light with a faint honeyed gleam as it coats the inside of the clay. The smell that rises from the open neck is mild and slightly sweet, a woody sweetness that reminds you of the acacia trees that grow along the edge of the cultivation, their thorny branches and yellow blossoms familiar from every walk to the river. You pour a small amount of the gum solution into a clean, shallow dish, a small bowl made from the same pale clay, watching the liquid settle into a perfectly level pool. The amount is measured by eye and by habit, roughly 1 part binder to 2 parts pigment, a proportion that you have learned through countless small adjustments over the years. Too little gum and the paint will dry weak and powdery, flaking from the plaster at the slightest touch. Too much, and it will become glossy and brittle, cracking into tiny fissures as it ages. The correct balance lies somewhere in the narrow space between these two failures, and you have found it so many times that your hands know the measure without conscious thought. You set the flask aside, still unstoppered, and you take up a small spatula carved from a sliver of hippopotamus ivory, its surface yellowed with age and polished to a soft gleam from the oils of your own skin. The spatula is flat and thin, with a rounded tip, and it feels cool and smooth between your fingers. You now combine the two elements, the red ochre and the gum solution, working on the flat surface of your palette, which you have placed across your knees. The palette is a large potsherd, a fragment of a broken storage jar that you found years ago in the workman's village, its inner surface unglazed and slightly porous, perfect for holding and mixing paint. You tip a portion of the red ochre from the bowl onto the center of the potsherd, a mound of deep crimson powder that holds its shape like a tiny dune, and then you use the tip of the spatula to create a small hollow in the top of the mound, a crater no wider than your thumbnail. Into this hollow you pour a few drops of the gum solution, the amber liquid sinking immediately into the powder and darkening it to the color of drying blood, a deep, rich burgundy that spreads outward through the pigment like water soaking into dry earth. You wait for a few heartbeats, letting the liquid saturate the core of the mound, and then you begin to mix. The mixing starts with a gentle folding motion, the spatula drawing the dry pigment from the edges of the mound into the wet center, turning the powder over and over as it absorbs the gum. The paste that forms is initially lumpy and inconsistent, a dark, wet mass surrounded by dry powder that resists incorporation, and you work the spatula with a patient, circular motion, pressing the lumps against the surface of the potsherd to break them apart. The sound is a soft, sticky smacking as the paste lifts and folds, a sound that is almost silent but not quite, a whisper of viscosity that speaks of the slow marriage of mineral and gum. You continue folding and pressing, and gradually the mixture becomes more uniform, the dry powder disappearing into the wet mass until the whole mound has transformed into a thick, glossy paste, the color of crushed pomegranate seeds. The paste is still too stiff for painting, too thick to flow smoothly from a brush, and so you add a few more drops of gum solution, dripping them carefully from the tip of the spatula, watching as each drop beads on the surface of the paste before being folded under. The consistency changes slowly, the paste relaxing into a softer, more fluid state, and you test it frequently by lifting the spatula and letting the paint drip back onto the palette. At first it falls in a heavy dollop that holds its shape. Then, as you add more liquid and continue mixing, it begins to flow in a thin, continuous ribbon that folds over itself like a length of red silk. The color is now fully developed, the deep, warm red that you worked so long to achieve in the grinding, and it seems to glow against the pale terracotta of the potsherd, a jewel-like intensity that is deeply satisfying to observe. You set the palette aside for a moment and clean the spatula with a damp cloth, wiping the ivory until it gleams, and then you turn to the second binder that will give the paint its final working properties. From your bag you take a small clay cup containing 2 fresh eggs, carried carefully from the village and protected by a wrapping of soft linen. The eggs are small and pale brown, still warm from the morning, and you select one, holding it up to the lamp to check that the shell is intact and free of cracks. You then crack the egg on the rim of a clean bowl, a sharp, precise tap that splits the shell neatly into 2 halves. You hold the halves over the bowl and let the white drain away, tilting the shell back and forth so that the clear, viscous liquid slides out in a slow, reluctant stream, stretching into long strands before breaking and falling into the bowl. The yolk remains behind in one half of the shell, a perfect globe of deep orange yellow, trembling slightly with the movement of your hand. You transfer the yolk carefully to the other half of the shell, pouring off the last traces of white, and then you tip the yolk into a small, separate dish, a shallow cup no larger than your thumb joint. The yolk sits there like a tiny sun, its surface taut and glossy, its color so intense that it seems to emit a light of its own. You add a few drops of clean water from your leather bottle to the yolk, and you stir the mixture with a thin reed splinter, breaking the membrane that holds the yolk together and blending the contents into a smooth, thin liquid the color of marigold petals. This is the tempera, a natural emulsion that will bind the pigment particles more firmly to the plaster and give the dried paint a slight resilience, preventing it from cracking as the tomb walls expand and contract with the slow breathing of the seasons. The egg tempera has been used by painters since the time of the first tombs, and you have prepared it so many times that the sequence of movements feels like a single fluid gesture. Crack, separate, dilute, stir. You set the dish of tempera beside the palette and return your attention to the red ochre paste. Using the ivory spatula, you now incorporate a small amount of the egg mixture into the paint, folding it in with the same slow, circular motion you used before. The paste initially resists, the oily yolk forming tiny beads that refuse to blend, but you persist, pressing and turning the mixture, until the beads disappear and the paint takes on a new quality. It becomes slightly more glossy, more cohesive, and when you lift the spatula, the paint drips from the tip in a smooth, unbroken thread that piles onto itself in a neat coil. You test the paint by drawing a line on the back of your hand, a single stroke that leaves a bright red mark, and you watch as it dries quickly in the dry tomb air, darkening slightly and losing its gloss to become a soft, matte red that does not rub off when you press a finger against it. This is the correct consistency, the perfect balance of pigment, gun, and egg, and you feel a quiet satisfaction settle into your chest, a small private acknowledgement of a task completed well. You now clean the spatula once more and set it aside, then cover the mixed paint on the palette with an upturned bowl to keep out dust. The paint will stay workable for several hours, its moisture slowly evaporating into the dry air, and you will need to use it before the day's end, but for now it waits as patiently as everything else in the tomb. You pour a little more oil into the lamps, which are burned down again, and you adjust the wicks with a splinter of reed until the flames are steady and bright. The light falls across your small workspace, illuminating the bowl of red ochre, the covered palette, the dish of egg tempera, the unstoppered flask of gum solution, and the scattered tools that lie in their ordered places. The silence of the tomb returns, deep and complete, and you take a moment to breathe slowly, to rest your hands on your knees, to let your gaze travel across the painted walls where the gods and goddesses stand in their eternal stillness. You think, in a quiet, drifting way, about the nature of the paint you have just made. The red ochre came from the eastern desert, carried by donkey across the dry hills. The gum arabic came from the acacia trees of the river valley. The egg came from the hens that scratch in the dust of the workman's village. The water came from the Nile, the great river that flows through the center of the world. All these separate elements, each from a different corner of the land, have come together on your palette to form a single substance, a red paint that will outlast your own life by thousands of years. You do not dwell on this thought with any grand emotion. It is simply a fact, a quiet truth that sits in the back of your mind like a stone resting on the bottom of a clear pool. You are part of a long chain of hands, each one grinding and mixing and painting, each one passing the craft forward into an unseeable future, and your own hands are just one link among many, doing the same work in the same way, day after day, year after year. The lamp flames flicker once, almost imperceptibly, a tiny shiver of light that passes through both flames at the same moment, perhaps caused by a distant movement of air from the tomb entrance. You watch the flames steady themselves, and you notice how the light plays across the surface of the gum solution in the unstoppered flask, a tiny reflection of the flame dancing on the amber liquid. The tomb around you is so still that you can hear the faint bubbling of the oil as it is drawn up through the flax wicks, a sound so quiet that it exists at the very edge of hearing, a gentle, continuous whisper that has been present the whole time without your noticing. You close your eyes for a moment, just a brief rest, and you feel the cool air on your eyelids, the solid presence of the stool beneath you, the faint scent of linseed oil and gum and dry plaster. There is no urgency, no pressing task that cannot wait a little longer, and you allow yourself to sit in this peaceful stillness until you feel ready to move again. When you open your eyes, nothing has changed. The lamps still burn, the paint still waits, the walls still hold their silent images. You reach for the flask of gum solution and stopper it carefully, the linen plug fitting snugly into the clay neck, and you set the flask back in your bag. The dish of egg tempera you cover with a small piece of cloth to keep it from drying out too quickly. The bowl of remaining red ochre you seal with its lid and place beside the grinding slab, ready for the next session when more paint will be needed. Each action is unhurried and complete, one movement flowing into the next without haste. You wipe your hands on the damp cloth, removing the last traces of red pigment from your fingers, and you hold them up to the lamp to check that they are clean. The faint pink stain that remains under your nails and in the creases of your knuckles is a permanent mark of your trade, a color that will never fully wash away, and you do not mind it. It is as familiar as the lines on your palms. You are now ready to prepare the wall, to smooth the plaster and apply the whitewash, to snap the grid lines and begin the slow, precise work of outlining the figures. The paint is mixed, the tools are ready, and the long middle hours of the day stretch before you, as calm and unhurried as the morning that brought you here. The section of wall that you will work on today occupies the lower portion of the right-hand chamber, a panel of plaster that was applied 2 weeks ago and has now cured to a hard matte finish, the color of sun-bleached linen. Before any paint can touch its surface, the plaster must receive a final smoothing, because even the most carefully applied layers will develop tiny irregularities as they dry, microscopic ridges where the trowel paused, faint depressions where the plaster settled into itself, a light grittiness caused by grains of sand that floated to the surface during the curing. You approach the wall with a flat piece of cedar wood that has been wrapped in several layers of fine linen, a tool that resembles a small pad and fits comfortably into your palm. The linen is old and soft, washed many times, and it has been dampened with a few drops of water from your bowl so that it will glide over the plaster without scratching. You begin at the upper left corner of the panel, pressing the padded wood against the plaster with a light, even pressure, and you draw it downward in a long, continuous stroke that covers the full height of the prepared area. The sound it makes is a soft, papery whisper, the friction of damp linen against porous gypsum, a sound so quiet that it barely registers above the silence of the tomb. At the bottom of the stroke, you lift the pad, move it a hand's width to the right, and draw it upward, overlapping the previous stroke by a finger's width so that no part of the wall is missed. You continue this pattern, down and up, shifting rightward by small increments, your arm moving with the steady mechanical patience of a water wheel turning in a slow current. The lamplight falls across the plaster at an angle, and as you work you can see the subtle change in the surface. The faintest imperfections disappear under the pad. The tiny sand grains are pressed back into the plaster or lifted away, and the wall takes on a uniform smoothness that feels like cool silk when you run your dry fingertips over it. When you've covered the entire panel with these vertical strokes, you turn the pad over to a dry side of the linen and repeat the process with horizontal strokes, moving from top to bottom, left to right. This second pass catches any irregularities that the vertical strokes may have missed, and it also burnishes the surface very slightly, compacting the outermost layer of gypsum crystals into a denser, more receptive ground for the paint. You work slowly, your attention resting on the feeling of the pad in your hand and the gradual transformation of the plaster under your touch. There is a small area near the bottom center where a crack has begun to form, a hairline fissure no wider than a thread, probably caused by a slight settling of the plaster as it dried. You pause at this spot and examine it closely, bending down so that your eyes are level with the crack, and you trace its path with the tip of your finger. The crack does not extend through the full thickness of the plaster. It is a surface flaw only, and it can be repaired easily enough. From your bag, you take a small clay pot containing a paste of gypsum powder, mixed with a very dilute gum solution, a repair compound that you prepared specifically for this purpose. The paste is white and thick, like soft cheese, and you pick up a tiny amount on the tip of your finger before pressing it gently into the crack. You work the paste back and forth across the fissure until it fills the narrow gap completely, and then you smooth the excess away with the edge of your palm, leaving the surface flush and unbroken. The repair will dry within the hour and become indistinguishable from the surrounding plaster. By the time you apply the whitewash, not even your own eye will be able to find the spot. You wipe your hand on your damp cloth and continue the smoothing, passing the linen pad over the repaired area with extra gentleness, blending the new gypsum into the old until the transition is seamless. When the smoothing is finished, you step back from the wall and let your eyes travel across the entire panel, checking for any spots that you might have missed. The plaster now has a soft, even luster, a surface that seems almost to glow in the lamplight, and it is completely smooth to the touch, without a single grain or ridge to disturb the flow of the brush. You are satisfied, and you set the smoothing pad aside, flexing your fingers a few times to release the slight tension that has built up from holding the tool. You then turn your attention to the next stage of the preparation, the whitewash. The whitewash is a thin, milky liquid made from gypsum powder and water, with a tiny amount of gum solution added to help it adhere to the plaster. You prepare it fresh each time you need it, because the mixture begins to thicken and set within a few hours of being combined. You take a clean bowl, pour into it a measured amount of water from your leather bottle, and then sprinkle in the gypsum powder from a small linen bag, adding it gradually while stirring with a reed splinter. The powder swirls into the water in soft white clouds that bloom and then dissolve, and the stirring creates a faint, musical clinking as the splinter strikes the sides of the bowl. You stir until the mixture is perfectly smooth, the consistency of fresh milk, with no lumps or grains remaining. The bowl of whitewash is placed on a flat stone near the wall, and you select a wide brush from your collection, a brush made from a split reed that has been beaten at one end into a soft, flat fan of fibers. The brush is as wide as 3 fingers held together, and it holds a generous amount of liquid. You dip the brush into the whitewash and let the excess drain back into the bowl for a moment, watching the milky liquid drip from the fibers in a thin, steady stream. Then you turn to the wall and apply the first stroke, a broad horizontal sweep that begins at the upper left and travels smoothly to the right. The whitewash goes onto the plaster as a translucent, watery film, the color of diluted milk, and it dries almost immediately in the dry tomb air, the moisture wicking into the plaster and leaving behind a fine, even layer of gypsum crystals. The effect is subtle but important. The whitewash fills any remaining microscopic pores in the plaster and creates a perfectly uniform white ground that will make the colors applied on top appear more brilliant, the reds deeper and the blues more vivid. You work your way down the panel with steady, overlapping strokes, each new stroke blending into the previous one while it is still slightly damp, so that no seam lines are visible. The whitewashing takes time because each section must be covered completely and evenly, and you pause often to reload the brush and to check the consistency of the mixture in the bowl. The whitewash tends to settle as it sits, the heavier gypsum particles drifting downward, and so you stir it frequently, the reed splinter making the same soft clinking sound against the clay. You also adjust the position of the lamp once, moving it closer to the wall so that the raking light will reveal any thin spots that you might otherwise miss. The lamp is warm near your face as you lean in, and you can feel its small heat against your cheek, a pleasant contrast to the cool air of the tomb. As the whitewash dries, the wall gradually transforms from a pale cream color to a brilliant matte white, a surface so clean and luminous that it seems to hold the lamplight within itself, radiating a soft glow that brightens the whole chamber. When the entire panel has been covered and the whitewash has dried to a uniform finish, you step back again and observe your work with a quiet, unhurried gaze. The wall is now a perfect canvas, a blank field of white that waits for the first marks of the grid, the first outlines, the first colors. It is a moment of pure potential, and you let it hang in the silence for a while, not out of hesitation, but out of a calm appreciation for the order of the process. Each stage has its own completion, its own small sense of arrival, and this is one of them. The wall prepared, the tools ready, the day moving forward at its own steady pace. Now you gather the materials for the next step, the snapping of the grid lines. From your bag you retrieve a length of linen string that you prepared earlier in the week, a thin, tightly twisted cord that has been dyed a deep red by soaking it in a solution of red ochre and water and then allowing it to dry. The string is wound around a small wooden peg and you unwind it carefully, laying it out straight on the floor to check for tangles. The ochre dye has penetrated the fibers completely, and the string is stiff with dried pigment, a deep terracotta color that will leave a crisp, fine line when snapped against the plaster. You also take out a second peg, a small sharpened stick that will serve as an anchor point, and you gather your measuring cord, a longer piece of undyed string that is knotted at regular intervals corresponding to the units of the traditional grid. The grid is the foundation of all the painting that will follow, a network of horizontal and vertical lines that divides the wall into squares, each square representing one unit of the canon of proportions. The system is ancient and exact, taught to you by your own teacher when you were a young apprentice, and you have laid it out so many times that your hands know the measurements without conscious calculation. You begin by establishing the horizontal lines, which will run across the panel at set heights. You press the first anchor peg into the plaster at the far left edge of the panel, near the top, pushing it firmly into the soft material until it holds fast. Then you walk slowly to the right side of the panel, unspooling the red string behind you, and you hold it taut against the wall at the corresponding point on the opposite edge. You check the height against your knotted measuring cord, making a small adjustment so that the string aligns with the correct knot, and then you pull the string away from the wall by a finger's width and release it with a sharp snap. The string strikes the plaster with a soft, precise sound, a twang that is quickly swallowed by the silence, and it leaves behind a fine straight line of red ochre that stretches from one edge of the panel to the other. The line is delicate but clear, a faint tracing that will guide your brush without being visible in the finished painting. You inspect it closely, checking that it is level and unbroken, and then you move the anchor peg to the next position and repeat the process. Each horizontal line is placed according to the canon, marking the divisions that will determine the heights of the figure's shoulders, waists, knees, and the placement of the hieroglyphic register above and below. The work is methodical and repetitive, requiring a steady hand and a patient eye, and you fall into its rhythm as naturally as breathing. Snap. Inspect. Move the peg. Snap. Inspect. Move the peg. Snap. Inspect. Move the peg. The red lines accumulate on the white wall, a delicate scaffolding that will support the entire composition. When the horizontal lines are all in place, you begin the vertical lines, which will establish the widths of the figures and the spacing of the columns of text. For these you work from top to bottom, anchoring the peg at the upper edge of the panel and snapping the string downward, the red dust falling in a straight, vertical rain that settles onto the plaster. The vertical lines intersect the horizontal ones at precise right angles, creating a network of squares that covers the entire panel, each square no larger than the palm of your hand. The grid is a thing of quiet beauty in itself, a mathematical pattern that brings order to the blank wall, and you pause for a moment to look at it, to trace the lines with your eyes from top to bottom and side to side. There is a deep satisfaction in seeing the grid complete, a sense of readiness that is entirely calm and unhurried. You now clean the red string by snapping it several times against the floor, releasing the last loose particles of ochre, and then you wind it back around the peg and return it to your bag. The anchor pegs are pulled from the wall, leaving tiny holes that you fill with a dab of gypsum paste, smoothing them over with a fingertip until they disappear. The grid lines, faint and red, remain on the white surface, a silent map that waits for the first charcoal marks of the figures. You collect the bowl of whitewash and the smoothing pad, wiping them clean and setting them aside, and you stretch your arms slowly, feeling the pleasant tiredness that has settled into your shoulders from the repeated reaching and snapping. The day has moved forward without any sense of rush, and the wall is now fully prepared, a perfect ground for the slow, careful work of outlining that will come next. You take a sip of water from your bottle, feel the cool liquid slide down your dry throat, and you sit for a while on your stool, resting in the lamplight, letting the silence of the tomb hold you in its steady, patient embrace. With the grid line standing faint and red against the whitewashed plaster, you now turn to the finest of your reed brushes, the one you have kept protected inside a hollow reed tube since the day you shaped it. You draw it out carefully, pinching the slender stem between your thumb and forefinger, and you hold it up to the lamp to inspect its tip. The chewed fibers at the end have softened into a single delicate point, as fine as a cat's whisker, and they taper so gradually that the transition from reed stem to brush tip is almost invisible. This brush is the tool you use for the most precise work, the outlining of the sacred figures, where a single stray hair can throw off the curve of a shoulder or the angle of a divine eye. You dip the tip into your bowl of clean water, letting it drink for a moment, and then you touch it gently to a scrap of linen to remove the excess moisture. The fibers cling together perfectly, forming a point so sharp that it seems to want to draw of its own accord. Beside you on the flat stone that serves as a small work table, you have set out a shallow dish containing a portion of the red ochre paint that you mixed earlier, thinned with a few additional drops of gum solution so that it flows more freely from the brush. The thinned paint has a slightly different character than the full-body paste on your palette. It is more translucent, a deep rose rather than a dense crimson, and it will create lines that are crisp and fluid without building up too much thickness on the plaster. You stir the thinned paint once with the tip of the brush, watching the color swirl and settle, and then you rise from your stool and carry the brush and the dish to the wall. The lamp near this section of the wall has been adjusted to cast its light at a shallow angle across the surface, creating soft shadows that will help you see the exact path of each stroke. You position yourself so that your own shadow falls away from the work area, your right shoulder toward the lamp, and you stand with your feet placed slightly apart, a stable and comfortable stance that you can hold for long periods without fatigue. The lowest register of the wall already carries the faint marks of yesterday's work, a preliminary sketch drawn in charcoal, the black lines soft and slightly dusty on the white ground. The sketch shows a seated figure of Osiris, the god of the dead and the ruler of the underworld, his body wrapped in the tight white shroud of mummification, his arms crossed over his chest and holding the crook and flail, the symbols of his eternal authority. The sketch was drawn freehand within the squares of the grid, the proportions carefully checked against the canon, and it now waits for the permanent red outline that will fix it in place. You lean in close, so close that you can smell the faint, dusty scent of the charcoal, and you study the lines with a quiet, unhurried attention. The charcoal marks are guides only. They will be covered by the red paint and then brushed away entirely. Their purpose served. You touch the very tip of your brush to the thinned red paint, drawing it through the liquid with a slow, steady hand until the fibers are loaded, but not dripping. The first stroke is always the most deliberate, the moment when the blank wall and the idea in your mind begin their long transformation into a single visible form. You position the brush at the crown of the god's head, where the charcoal sketch shows the curve of the tall white headjet crown with its distinctive bulbous top, and you lower the tip onto the plaster with a touch so light that you barely feel the contact through the reed stem. The red paint flows from the brush onto the wall in a fine, even line, and you begin to draw the brush downward along the charcoal guide, tracing the contour of the crown, then the forehead, then the bridge of the nose. Your hand moves with a slow, continuous motion, the brush never stopping or hesitating, and the line that unspools behind it is as smooth as a thread of silk, a deep red curve that follows the charcoal exactly. You pause at the tip of the nose and lift the brush, letting the line dry for a moment while you consider the next portion of the outline. The pause is not a break in concentration, but a natural part of the rhythm, a brief stillness that allows you to see what you have just drawn and to align your hand for what comes next. When the line is dried to a soft matte finish, you dip the brush again and continue, tracing the lips, the chin, and the smooth line of the jaw. The face of Osiris is serene and symmetrical, the features rendered according to the conventions that have been used since the earliest dynasties, the eye large and almond-shaped, the mouth small and closed, the expression one of eternal calm. You draw each feature with the same unhurried precision, the brush point following the charcoal underdrawing as faithfully as a shadow follows a walking figure. When the face is complete, you step back a half pace and observe your work, comparing the red outline on the left side of the face to the right side that you have yet to draw. Symmetry is essential in the depiction of the gods, and you check it by holding up a knotted measuring cord vertically against the center of the face, noting the small adjustments that will be necessary. You then return to the wall and trace the right side of the face, the crown, and the line of the neck, working with the same slow, careful strokes. The completed face now floats on the white plaster, a perfect red silhouette that seems to hover just above the surface, waiting for the colors that will fill it. You move downward now, tracing the shoulders and the crossed arms. The figure of Osiris is wrapped in a tight shroud that conceals the shape of the body beneath, leaving only the hands visible where they emerge from the wrappings to grip the crook and flail. The charcoal sketch shows the hands with their long, slender fingers, each finger drawn according to the canon with its precise length and spacing, and you follow these lines with your brush, painting the thin red lines that separate the fingers and define the knuckles. The crook is a curved staff, its shape like a shepherd's crook, and you trace its arc with a single, flowing stroke that rises from the fist and curves outward and downward. The flail is a straight handle with 3 pendant strands hanging from its end, and you paint each strand as a separate, delicate line that droops slightly under the pull of gravity. These details require your closest attention, because the symbols must be rendered correctly for the image to serve its sacred purpose, and you work with your face near the wall, your breath held and then released in slow, quiet exhalations. The silence of the tomb, which has been your constant companion throughout the morning, now seems to deepen as you paint. The only sounds are the tiny scratch of the reed brush on the plaster, a sound like a mouse's footfall, and the occasional soft tap of the brush against the rim of the dish as you recharge it with paint. The lamp beside you burns steadily, its flame a still bright leaf of orange that never wavers, and the shadows on the wall remain fixed in place, as if the light itself has been carved from amber. You are aware of time passing only as a gentle drift in the back of your mind, a slow current that carries you forward through the strokes of the brush without any need to measure or count. The work has become a kind of meditation, a quiet focus state in which your hand and your eye and the emerging figure are the only things that exist. As you trace the lower portion of the shroud, where the wrapped legs taper down to the feet, you encounter a small difficulty. The charcoal line in this area has smudged slightly, probably from your sleeve brushing against it during the whitewashing earlier, and the exact path of the outline is no longer clear. You pause and examine the smudged area under the lamplight, tilting your head to see past the blur. The ghost of the original line is still faintly visible beneath the smudge, a pale grey trace on the white plaster, and you use it as a guide while redrawing the outline with a slightly slower, more deliberate hand. The correction requires no erasure, no dramatic alteration. You simply paint the correct line over and slightly to the side of the smudge, and the old charcoal mark, now irrelevant, will be brushed away when the painting is finished. The error and its correction are both part of the ordinary flow of the work, and they pass without any disturbance to your calm. When the entire outline of Osiris is complete, you step back once more and survey the full figure from crown to feet. The red lines stand out crisply against the white ground, a delicate skeleton of the god that waits to be clothed in color. The proportions are correct, the lines are smooth and unbroken, and the figure holds the serene, eternal stillness that is proper to the divine. You clean your fine brush in the bowl of water, swirling it gently until the red pigment loosens from the fibers and drifts away in a pale pink cloud, and then you dry the brush on a clean corner of your linen cloth, reshaping the tip with your fingers so that it will be ready for the next use. The brush is returned to its protective reed tube, and the tube is set carefully beside the other brushes on the cloth. You now prepare for the next stage of the outlining by selecting a slightly thicker brush, one that will hold more paint and create a broader line for the borders and the dividing bands that separate the registers. This brush is also made of a chewed reed, but its tip is blunt rather than pointed, and it produces a line that is uniform in width, like a narrow ribbon of color. You take a portion of the red ochre paint from your palette, thinned to the same flowing consistency as before, and you pour it into a clean dish. The borders that you will paint are the horizontal bands that run above and below the figure of Osiris, framing the scene and separating it from the hieroglyphic registers that will be added later. You check the grid lines that you snapped earlier, the faint red marks that indicate the positions of these borders, and you align your brush with the upper guideline before beginning the first stroke. The border line is drawn in a single, continuous pass from the left edge of the panel to the right, your hand moving at a steady speed that keeps the line uniform in thickness and perfectly straight. The grid line serves as your guide, but your eye and your hand do the real work, making the tiny unconscious adjustments that compensate for any slight waviness in the snapped line. When you reach the right edge of the panel, you lift the brush and inspect the line, checking that it is straight and that the paint has been applied evenly. The border is a simple thing, just a straight red line, but it is essential to the order of the composition, and you take the same care with it that you took with the face of the god. You then paint the lower border in the same way, and the two parallel lines now enclose the figure of Osiris in a clean rectangular frame, a space of calm order within the larger field of the wall. With the borders in place, you turn your attention to the small area above the figure where a short horizontal inscription will be painted in hieroglyphs. The charcoal sketch for this inscription is already on the wall, a row of tiny, intricate symbols that spell out the name and titles of the god. You switch back to your finest brush and begin to trace these hieroglyphs with the same patient, precise strokes that you used for the figure. The owl, the reed leaf, the seated man, the water sign, each tiny symbol is painted with care, its proportions maintained within the small squares of the grid. The work is slow and absorbing, and you lose yourself in it completely. The outside world forgotten beyond the circle of lamplight and the white wall and the red lines that flow from your brush. When at last the inscription is outlined, you set down your brush and roll your shoulders gently, feeling the stiffness that has accumulated from standing in one position for so long. You walk to the entrance of the tomb and look out at the valley, where the sun is now high and bright, the shadows short and sharp, the heat shimmering above the pale rocks. The air outside is warm and dry, and you breathe it in for a few moments, letting your eyes rest on the distant hazy line of the cultivation far below. Then you return to the cool interior, to the lamplight and the waiting wall, and you sit on your stool for a short rest, the day's work half done, the figure of Osiris outlined and waiting, the quiet of the tomb wrapping around you like a soft, heavy blanket. The red outlines of Osiris have dried to a soft, matte finish on the whitewashed plaster, and the figure now waits in its delicate framework, a ghost of the god drawn in the color of dried pomegranate. Before any color can be laid into these outlines, you must prepare the full palette of paints that the scene requires. Because a tomb painting is built from a small ancient set of hues, each one derived from the minerals of the earth or the products of the workshop fire. You return to your grinding slab and your handstone, which rest on the flat rock near the first lamp, and you consider the pigments that you will need for the day's painting. The seated Osiris will require green for his divine skin, white for his shroud and crown, red for the broad collar and the borders, yellow for the details of the throne, blue for the background of the inscription, and black for the final outlines and the pupils of the eyes. Some of these colors are already mixed and waiting. Others must be prepared fresh from their raw materials. You begin with the yellow ochre, a pigment that you will need in generous quantities for the throne and for the small accents that appear throughout the register. From your row of stoppered pots, you select the one that holds the limonite, a soft, earthy mineral that you collected yourself from the eastern desert during the previous season. The raw limonite is lighter in weight than the hematite, its surface a matte mustardy brown rather than a dark metallic gleam, and it crumbles more easily under pressure. You place a chunk of this mineral on the grinding slab and bring the handstone down with a gentle pressure, feeling the limonite yield almost immediately into a coarse, gritty powder, the color of dry sand. The sound it makes is softer than a hematite grinding, a low, mumbling crunch that speaks of the mineral's more friable nature, and the powder spreads quickly across the slab in a wide, pale fan. You gather the coarse grains into a pile with your palm fiber brush and begin the finer grinding, moving the hamstone in slow, patient circles that reduce the particles by degrees. The limonite powder lightens as it becomes finer, shifting from a dull tan to a warm golden yellow, the color of sunlit sandstone or the yolk of a fresh egg. You pause to sift the first batch through your linen cloth, shaking the fine dust into a clean bowl while the remaining coarse grains are returned to the slab for further grinding, and the cycle repeats itself with the same steady, hypnotic rhythm that you have known since your earliest days as an apprentice. The yellow ochre accumulates in the bowl, a soft, silky powder that seems to hold a faint warmth of its own, as if the desert sun that baked the limonite for millennia has left some trace of its heat within the mineral. When you have prepared enough yellow to fill a small hen's egg, you set the bowl aside and turn to the next pigment. The Egyptian blue is a different kind of color, not a ground mineral, but a manufactured substance, a frit made by melting silica, copper, calcium, and an alkali in a kiln until they fuse into a glassy blue mass. You keep a small store of this blue frit in a leather pouch, the chunks irregular and brittle, their surfaces a deep, brilliant azure that seems almost to vibrate in the lamplight. The frit is harder than the ochres, and grinding it requires a firmer pressure and a longer patience. You place a piece on the slab and strike it once with the handstone to fracture it, the fragments skittering across the diorite with a sound like breaking pottery. Then you begin to grind, working the fragments under the stone with a steady pressing motion that produces a gritty, high-pitched hiss. The blue powder is coarser than the ochres at first, resisting the stone's persuasion, but you persist, pausing often to sift and regrind, until the bowl receives a small mound of the most brilliant color you possess, a deep celestial blue that is the hue of the midday sky seen through a cleft in the cliffs, a color so intense that it seems to stain the air around it. You pause in your grinding to roll the stiffness from your wrist, and your eyes wander across the tomb walls to the patches of this same blue that were painted by other hands in other seasons. The blue has held its brilliance perfectly in the dry darkness, as vivid now as the day it was applied, and you feel a quiet connection to the painters who came before you, their hands moving through the same motions, their ears hearing the same hiss of the grinding stone. The thought passes through your mind without weight, like a bird crossing the sky, and then you return to the slab to grind the last of the blue frit into a powder as fine as the yellow ochre beside it. The black pigment is the simplest of all, requiring no grinding in the traditional sense. You take a stick of charcoal from your bag, a piece of acacia wood that was burned slowly in a closed pot until it carbonized completely, and you examine its surface under the lamp. The charcoal is light and brittle, its structure a lattice of pure carbon that leaves a dark smudge on your fingers when you touch it. You set the stick on a flat stone and use a small, clean handstone to crush it gently, not grinding but pressing and crumbling, the charcoal reducing with a soft, dry crackle into a fine, deep black powder. The sound is delicate, like dry leaves crushed in a closed fist, and the powder that results is so light that it floats on the faintest currents of air, threatening to rise in small dark puffs. You work slowly and carefully, keeping your movements minimal to avoid stirring the powder, and you transfer the ground charcoal into a small clay pot using a brush and a steady hand. The white pigment is gypsum, the same material that forms the plaster of the walls, and you have a plentiful supply in a linen bag. You pour a small mound of the white powder onto a clean area of the slab, but you do not grind it further, because the gypsum is already as fine as flour. You simply sift it through your linen cloth to remove any stray lumps or impurities, letting the fine dust fall into a bowl like a drift of pale snow. The white is a soft, chalky color with a slight coolness to it, the color of moonlight on limestone, and it will serve for the shroud of Osiris, the white crown, and the highlights that give volume to flat forms. With all 4 dry pigments prepared, you now turn to the task of mixing each one into a workable paint. You arrange 4 small clean dishes on the flat stone beside your palette, and into each dish you pour a small amount of the gum arabic solution from your unstoppered flask. The pale amber liquid catching the lamplight and gleaming like thin honey. The egg temper mixture that you prepared earlier is still fresh in its covered dish, and you add a few drops to each pool of gum solution, stirring the combined binder with a clean reed splinter until it forms a uniform, slightly thickened liquid. The proportion of gum to egg is a matter of long habit, and you measure it by eye, the same way you have done since your teacher first showed you how the yolk strengthens the paint and the gum gives it flow. You begin mixing the colors one at a time, starting with the yellow ochre. You tip a small mound of the golden powder into the first dish and fold it into the binder with the ivory spatula, using the same patient circular motion that you used for the red. The yellow powder absorbs the liquid slowly, darkening from a pale sand color to a rich warm gold, the hue of ripe barley in the field. You work the paste until it is smooth and uniform, testing the consistency by lifting the spatula and watching the paint drip back into the dish in a thick, glossy ribbon. The yellow is a gentle color, a color of sunlight and grain and the gentle heat of the late afternoon, and seeing it pooled in the dish gives you a small, quiet pleasure that you do not put into words. Next you mix the blue, and this pigment behaves differently under the spatula. The ground for it is heavier and more granular than the ochre, and it absorbs the binder more slowly, forming at first a dark, pebbly paste that resists smoothing. You add a few extra drops of gum solution and work the mixture patiently, pressing out the tiny lumps against the side of the dish until the paste relaxes into a smooth, even cream, the color of a deep summer sky. The blue is the most precious of your colors, the one that requires the most effort to produce, and you treat it with a corresponding care, scraping every last trace from the sides of the dish and gathering it into a neat, glossy mound at the center. The black paint comes together quickly, the fine charcoal powder drinking the binder eagerly and turning into a dense, dark paste that is almost liquid in its smoothness. The black is a color of absolute depth, a color that seems to swallow the light rather than reflect it, and it will be used sparingly for the final outlines and the small details that give the painting its crispness and clarity. You stir it once more and set it aside. Finally, you mix the white, combining the gypsum powder with the binder to form a thick, creamy paint, the color of fresh milk. The white is the most opaque of all the colors, and it will be used not only for the large areas of the shroud and crown, but also for corrections, covering any small errors with a fresh, clean surface that can be repainted. You mix enough white to fill the dish nearly to the rim, because the white is used in larger quantities than any other color, and you want to have a generous supply ready. With the 4 new colors mixed, you now arrange your full palette on the large potsherd. The palette is wide and flat, a fragment of a storage jar that curves slightly upward at the edges, and it offers plenty of room for the separate pools of paint. You use the ivory spatula to transfer a portion of each color onto the palette, placing them in the order that you will use them. Red at one end, then yellow, then blue, then black, then white at the other end. Each color sits on the pale terracotta surface in a neat, glossy mound, the 5 paints forming a small rainbow of earth tones that gleam softly under the lamplight. You clean the spatula carefully between colors, wiping it on your damp cloth until the ivory shines, and you inspect each mound on the palette to ensure that the consistency is correct and that no stray grains of one color have contaminated another. The palette now holds everything you need for the painting that lies ahead. The deep red for the borders and the collar, the warm yellow for the throne, the celestial blue for the background of the inscription, the dense black for the final outlines, and the bright white for the shroud and the crown and the corrections. The colors seem to glow with a quiet intensity, their hues intensified by the oil lamp's warm light and by the contrast with the dark terracotta of the potsherd. You look at them for a long moment and you feel the same calm satisfaction that a farmer might feel looking at a field ready for planting, a sense of completeness and readiness that requires no celebration. You now prepare your brushes for the painting, selecting the medium brush that you will use to fill the large areas of color. This brush has a wider tip than your outlining brush. Its chewed fibers spread into a flat, soft edge that holds a generous amount of paint, and you dip it in water to moisten it before touching it to the paint. You also set out a small dish of clean water for rinsing between colors, and you check that your damp cloth is within easy reach. The two lamps are burning steadily in their niches, their flames adjusted to give an even warm light across the entire panel, and you stand before the wall with your palette in one hand and your brush in the other, the day's work stretching before you in a calm, unhurried expanse. Before you begin the coloring, you walk slowly around the chamber once, carrying a lamp to check on the other walls, the other figures that wait in various stages of completion. The air is cool and perfectly still, and your shadow moves across the painted scenes like a dark sail passing over calm water. The gods and goddesses on the walls regard you with their serene, flat eyes, their forms half emerged from the plaster, their colors bright or muted, depending on how long ago they were painted. Everything is in order, everything is as it should be, and you return to your panel with the feeling that the tomb is a small, complete world, a world of stone and pigment and silence, and that you are its quiet, patient keeper. You raise the brush, touch it to the first pool of color on your palette, and prepare to begin filling the empty outlines with the colors of the earth and the sky. The outline of Osiris waits on the whitewashed plaster, its fine red lines enclosing empty spaces that are ready to receive their colors, and you stand before the wall with your loaded palette and your medium brush. The day's long work of filling and covering spread out before you like a calm, slow river. The first color you will apply is the green of the god's divine skin, a hue that speaks of regeneration and the young papyrus shoots that push up through the black earth after the flood recedes. You have no green pigment already mixed on your palette, but you know how to make it, and you turn to the small dish of yellow ochre and the dish of Egyptian blue that sits side by side on the flat stone. Taking a clean mixing bowl, you transfer a small mound of the blue paste using the tip of your spatula, its color a deep, vivid azure, and beside it you place an equal amount of the yellow ochre, the warm gold of sunlit sand. You begin to blend them together with the spatula, folding the blue into the yellow in slow, patient strokes, and the transformation is gradual and quiet. At first the mixture is streaked with separate veins of gold and azure, but as you work the colors merge into a soft, muted green that deepens with each turn of the spatula until it reaches the exact shade of young papyrus stems, a cool, living green that seems to hold a hint of the river's moisture within its tone. You test the color on the back of your hand, drawing a short line that dries quickly to a soft matte finish, and you are satisfied. You transfer the green to a clean spot on your palette, placing it between the blue and yellow, and you clean the spatula and the mixing bowl before returning your attention to the wall. You begin the filling at the top of the figure, where the divine face of Osiris looks out from beneath the tall white crown. The face is an enclosed space bounded by the red outline you traced earlier, and you load your medium brush with the green paint, drawing it through the glossy mound until the fibers are evenly coated. The brush touches the plaster at the forehead, and you apply the color in a smooth horizontal stroke that follows the contours of the face, working from the crown downward across the brow and then over the cheeks and chin. The paint goes onto the plaster with a slight dampness that darkens the white ground for a moment before the dry air of the tomb begins to draw the moisture away, and you watch as the green settles into an even velvety layer that covers the plaster completely. The red outline contains the color neatly, the green stopping exactly at the inner edge of the line, and the face of the god emerges from the blank wall with a sudden, quiet presence. Its serene features now defined by color as well as by contour. You move downward from the face to the neck and then to the arms, which are crossed over the chest in the traditional pose of the wrapped dead. The arms are narrow spaces bounded by the tight red lines that you drew with such care, and you switch to a slightly smaller brush to fill them without overrunning the edges. The green paint covers the arms in smooth, even strokes, and you work slowly, reloading the brush after every few passes, your hand moving with the same steady, unhurried rhythm that you have maintained throughout the day. When you reach the hands, those long, slender fingers that grip the crook and flail, you switch to an even finer brush, one that will allow you to fill the tiny spaces between the red lines without blurring them. The fingers are painted one by one, each a small precise deposit of green that fills its allotted space completely, and when they are done the hands stand out clearly against the white shroud that you will paint next. The Shroud of Osiris is the largest area of white in the entire composition, a broad, wrapped garment that encloses the god's body from the chest down to the ankles, its surface marked only by a few subtle lines that indicate the folds of the linen wrappings. You clean your brush in the rinsing water, swirling it until the green pigment loosens and drifts away in a pale, cloudy swirl, and then you load it with the thick white paint from the largest mound on your palette. The white is opaque and heavy, its consistency like fresh cream, and it covers the plaster completely with a single stroke. You begin filling the shroud at the top, just below the crossed arms, and you work your way downward in long vertical strokes that overlap slightly to ensure an even coverage. The white paint dries quickly to a bright matte finish, the color of bleached linen under a noon sun, and it contrasts sharply with the deep green of the skin and the warm terracotta of the red outlines. The shroud is not entirely featureless. Within its white expanse there are a few faint lines of drapery that the charcoal sketch indicated, and you now trace these with a very pale grey, made by mixing a tiny speck of black into a small pool of white. The grey is so light that it is barely distinguishable from the white itself, just a whisper of shadow that gives a subtle sense of volume to the flat shape, and you apply it with a fine brush in short, delicate strokes that follow the charcoal guidelines. The drapery lines are a small detail, almost invisible from any distance, but they are part of the proper rendering of the god, and you give them the same unhurried attention that you've given to every other element of the painting. With the shroud complete, you turn to the tall white crown that rises from the god's head, the headjet crown with its distinctive bulbous top and its smooth tapering sides. This is another large area of white, and you fill it using the same thick white paint and the same steady, vertical strokes. The crown reaches nearly to the upper border of the register, its tip coming close to the red frame line that you painted earlier, and you are careful to keep the white contained within the outline, leaving a clean, sharp edge where the crown meets the background. When the crown is filled, you step back a pace and look at the figure as a whole, the green face and hands, the white shroud and crown, the red lines that define every contour. The god is now more than half complete, his form solid and present on the wall, and you feel a quiet sense of progress that is entirely calm, a simple acknowledgement that the work is moving forward as it should. The next area to be filled is the broad collar that encircles the god's neck and upper chest, a wide band of alternating red and yellow stripes that represents the elaborate jewelry worn by the divine and the royal dead. You begin by painting the entire collar area with a flat layer of yellow ochre, using a brush wide enough to cover the space efficiently, and you let this yellow ground dry completely before adding the red stripes on top. While the yellow dries, you turn to the throne upon which Osiris sits, a simple rectangular seat that is indicated by the red outlines at the lower portion of the register. The throne is to be painted in yellow with details in red and blue, and you fill its large flat surfaces with the same warm golden paint, applying it in smooth, even strokes that follow the direction of the throne's sides and seat. The yellow ochre covers the plaster with a soft, sun-like glow, and you think briefly of the acacia trees in bloom along the cultivation, their yellow blossoms bright against the dark green foliage. When the yellow ground of the collar has dried to a matte finish, you return to it with a fine brush and the deep red paint, and you begin to paint the thin, parallel stripes that will create the pattern. Each red stripe must be straight and evenly spaced, and you use a light touch, drawing the brush across the yellow surface in a single unbroken stroke for each line. The stripes accumulate slowly, one after another, and the collar gradually takes on its proper appearance of intricate, woven jewelry. The pattern is repetitive and soothing to paint, a simple back and forth of red lines across a golden field, and your hand falls into an easy rhythm that requires no conscious thought. Next you turn to the background of the inscription panel, the small area above the figure where the hieroglyphs have been outlined in red. This background is to be filled with the deep Egyptian blue, a color that will make the red hieroglyphs stand out with brilliant clarity. You load a medium brush with the blue paint, that precious, celestial color that took so long to grind, and you begin to fill the spaces around and between the tiny symbols. The work is delicate because the hieroglyphs are small and closely spaced, and you must paint the blue around them without obscuring the fine red outlines that define each owl and reed leaf and seated figure. You work slowly, your face close to the wall, the brush moving in small, careful strokes that fill the background while leaving the symbols themselves untouched. The blue sinks into the plaster with a slight darkening that fades as it dries, and the finished background will be a deep, even field of color, like a fragment of the sky brought into the darkness of the tomb. You pause now and then to flex your fingers and to rest your eyes, and during one of these pauses you walk to the tomb entrance and look out at the valley. The sun has passed its highest point and is beginning its slow descent toward the western cliffs, the shadows lengthening slightly, the heat of the day beginning to soften. A small breeze moves through the canyon, stirring the dust on the path, and you feel it against your face. a brief, warm touch that reminds you of the world outside. You stand there for a little while, breathing the dry air, and then you return to the cool interior and the steady lamplight. Back at the wall, you continue filling the remaining areas of the composition. The crook and flail that the god holds are painted yellow with red details. The small ankh symbol that hangs from his wrist is filled with blue, and the dividing border that frames the entire register receives a final, reinforcing coat of red to ensure its uniformity. Each area is filled in turn, each color applied with the same calm, unhurried care, and the figure of Osiris grows more complete with every stroke. The tomb around you remains utterly silent, the only sounds the soft brush of reed against plaster and the occasional quiet drip of water from your rinsing bowl. The lamps burn steadily, their flames small and bright, and the painted gods on the other walls watch with their flat, eternal eyes. You work on through the long afternoon, your brush moving in its patient rhythm, the colors spreading across the white ground like a slow, gentle tide, and a day drifts forward in perfect, uninterrupted stillness. When the sun outside the tomb reaches its highest point and begins its slow, imperceptible tilt toward the western ridges, a subtle change in the air seeps through the entrance, a gradual warming that nudges the constant coolness of the chamber by a single, barely noticeable degree. You feel this shift against the skin of your forearms as you stand before the half-painted figure of Osiris, the brush in your hand pausing of its own accord, the green paint on its tip beginning to thicken in the dry air. The lamp flames, which have burned without flickering or mourning, seem to soften slightly as your eyes grow tired from the close work, and a gentle, insistent signal rises from your body, a quiet request for rest that you have learned to recognize and honor over many years of labor in these tombs. You look at the wall where the colors are slowly filling the divine outline, the green face and the white shroud and the yellow throne all settling into their proper places, and you understand that the painting will wait without any impatience, the plaster holding the damp colors in its crystalline grip until you return. You set the brush down across the rim of your rinsing bowl, its reed handle balanced so that the painted tip hangs in the air and does not touch any surface, and you wipe your fingers slowly on the damp cloth that rests on the flat stone beside your palette, removing the traces of green and white and yellow that have gathered in the creases of your knuckles. You walk the few steps to the tomb entrance, your sandals making the same soft, scuffing sound on the packed earth floor that they have made all day, and you push the wooden door open just wide enough to slip through, leaving it ajar so that the interior does not become completely dark in your absence. The transition from the lamplit gloom to the full brightness of the midday desert is a shock that you have experienced hundreds of times, yet it never loses its quiet power. The light outside is so intense that it seems to be a physical substance, a wall of white gold brilliance that presses against your eyes and makes you squint, raising a hand to shield your face. You stand on the threshold for a moment, blinking rapidly as your pupils contract, and the world slowly resolves from a blinding glare into a landscape of pale rock and deep shadow, every edge sharpened by the vertical sun. The air outside is warm and dry, a different kind of dryness from the cool aridity of the tomb, and it carries the faint, clean smell of heated limestone and the distant, dusty fragrance of the desert beyond the valley. You step fully out of the doorway and into the narrow canyon that serves as the approach to the tomb, feeling the sun fall across your shoulders and the back of your neck like a heavy, golden cloth. The heat is not oppressive, but enveloping, a steady warmth that soaks through your linen tunic and loosens the muscles that have been tensed in the cool interior, and you roll your shoulders once, twice, enjoying the simple pleasure of movement after long stillness. The path before you is the same pale ribbon of trodden earth and crushed stone that you walked in the darkness of the early morning, but now it is transformed by the high sun into a bright, almost white track that winds between the tawny cliffs. You turn left, away from the main route that leads back to the village, and walk a short distance to a spot you know well. A place where a large boulder fell from the cliff face many generations ago and came to rest beside the path, creating a patch of shade that endures through the hottest hours of the day. The boulder is a massive block of limestone, twice the height of a man and rough-surfaced, its upper portions bleached by the sun to a pale chalky grey, while its lower flanks retain the warmer, honey-coloured tone of the native rock. At its base, where the stone meets the ground at a slight angle, a wedge of shadow is formed, a cool dark triangle that looks almost violet against the blazing sand around it. You walk around the boulder until you find the side that offers the deepest shade, and you lower yourself to the ground with a slow, deliberate movement, your back coming to rest against the warm stone. The surface of the boulder is not hot to the touch, but comfortably warm, heated through by the morning sun, and now radiating that stored warmth gently into your spine and shoulders, a sensation that is deeply soothing after the chill of the tomb. You stretch your legs out before you, crossing your ankles, and you let your hands rest loosely in your lap, the palms turned upward, the fingers slightly curled. The view from this shaded spot is a narrow slice of the valley, framed by the boulder on one side and a low ridge of rubble on the other, and it takes in a stretch of pale sand dotted with small dark stones and a few tough, thorny shrubs that have found a foothold in the arid soil. Beyond the mouth of the canyon, the valley floor opens out into a wider expanse that descends gradually toward the distant cultivation, a hazy green line that is barely visible through the shimmering heat. The heat shimmer is a constant, gentle movement in the air, a wavering distortion that makes the faraway rocks seem to dance and ripple, as if the earth itself is breathing slowly under the weight of the sun. You watch this shimmer with a relaxed, unfocused gaze, your thoughts not fixing on any particular thing, and the silence of the midday desert settles over you like a second layer of shade. After a short while, you reach for the small linen bundle that you carried with you from the tomb, the square of coarse cloth tied at the corners to form a loose pouch. You untie the knot with a few unhurried tugs and spread the cloth open on the sand beside you, revealing the simple meal that you packed in your house before dawn, a flat round of barley bread, slightly charred on one side from the hearth, a small handful of dried dates, their skins wrinkled and dark, and a single small onion, its papery outer layers rustling faintly as you handle it. The bread is dense and chewy, and you break off a piece with your fingers, the crust cracking softly, releasing a faint, nutty scent. You place the morsel in your mouth and chew slowly, the taste mild and earthy, the texture rough against your tongue, and you feel the simple nourishment beginning to restore the energy that the long morning's work has drawn from your body. Between bites of bread you eat one of the dates, its flesh sticky and intensely sweet, a concentrated taste of sugar and sun that seems to burst across your palate, and you suck the pit clean before setting it aside on the cloth. The onion comes last, its outer skin peeling away in dry crackling flakes to reveal the glossy white bulb beneath, and you bite into it with a crisp crunch that is the loudest sound you have heard since leaving the tomb. The onion is sharp and pungent, its juice making your eyes water slightly, and you eat it in small, deliberate bites, alternating with the last of the bread until the meal is finished. You fold the empty cloth and tuck it back into the waistband of your kilt, then take a long drink from the leather bottle that you also brought from the tomb. The water is tepid now, warmed by the sun, but it is still refreshing, and you let it linger in your mouth for a moment before swallowing, feeling it soothe the dryness that the mineral dust of the grinding has left in your throat. You replace the stopper and set the bottle on the ground beside you, and then you lean your head back against the warm stone of the boulder, your eyes half closing against the glare that filters through your lashes. The position is perfectly comfortable, the stone supporting your back, the sand soft beneath your legs, and the shade protecting you from the direct force of the sun, and you feel your body sinking into a state of deep, quiet rest that is not sleep, but something close to it, a suspension of effort and attention. High above the valley, a hawk appears in the pale blue dome of the sky, a small dark speck that you notice first as a flicker at the edge of your vision. You tilt your head back further and watch the bird as it circles with a slow, effortless grace, its broad wings held perfectly still, not a single flap disturbing their rigid span. The hawk rides a column of rising warm air, a thermal that lifts it higher and higher in a widening spiral, and you follow its path with your eyes, tracing the circle, then the wider circle above it, then the even wider one above that. The bird asks nothing of the world but to be carried by the air, and it seems to you, in your quiet, resting state, that the hawk is the perfect expression of the midday stillness, movement without effort, presence without purpose. You watch until the hawk spirals so high that it becomes a dot and then vanishes into the haze, and you lower your gaze back to the valley floor, where the shimmer continues its slow, liquid dance above the sand. The silence that surrounds you is not an empty silence, but a full one, a silence composed of many tiny, almost inaudible sounds that blend together into a single, continuous presence. You can hear the faint rustle of wind as it moves across the grains of sand, a sound so delicate that it is more like a sensation in your ears than a true noise, a soft, granular whisper that rises and falls with the passing of each small gust. Somewhere among the rocks a cricket begins to chirp, a single, high note that repeats at long, irregular intervals, and then stops as suddenly as it began, leaving the silence deeper than before. From far down the valley, carried on the warm air, comes the distant bell-like call of a goat, or perhaps a sheep, from the herds that graze along the edge of the cultivation, a sound so faint that you might have imagined it. These small noises do not disturb the peace, they are part of it. Threads woven into the fabric of the resting hour. You think of nothing in particular as you sit there. Your mind, which has been occupied all morning with the precise details of outlines and colors and the proportions of the grid, now empties itself gently, like a bowl of water tipped slowly onto dry sand. The painted wall inside the tomb waits without urgency, the plaster holding the damp colors steady, the lamp flames burning down at their measured pace, and you understand that this pause is not a break from the work, but a necessary part of it, a quiet interval in which the body restores itself and the eyes regain their freshness. You do not plan the next stage of the painting or worry about the passage of time. You simply let the moment hold you, your back against the warm stone, your hands resting loosely in your lap, your breath moving in and out with the slow, even rhythm of the resting body. After a time, you become aware of the warmth of the sun as it creeps slowly around the edge of the boulder, the patch of shade shifting inch by inch as the earth turns beneath you. The line of sunlight touches your knee, a bright, sharp edge of heat that contrasts with the coolness of the shadow on your other leg, and you shift your position slightly, drawing your knees up and moving further into the shade without any sense of hurry. The boulder itself has grown warmer against your back, absorbing the sun's energy and radiating it into your muscles, and the sensation is deeply comforting, a gentle heat that penetrates through the linen of your tunic and loosens the last traces of stiffness from your shoulders and neck. You close your eyes fully for a few moments, letting the red glow of the sun filter through your eyelids, and you listen to the steady, slow beating of your own heart, a sound that is usually lost beneath the noise of the waking world. But here, in the perfect stillness of the canyon, becomes audible, a quiet, faithful drum that has kept its rhythm since before you were born and will continue until long after you are gone. When you open your eyes again, the quality of the light has changed almost imperceptibly, the shadows lengthening a fraction, the heat losing its sharpest edge. The afternoon is moving forward at its own patient pace, and you feel a gentle readiness beginning to stir somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet signal that the rest has done its work and the time to return is approaching. You do not leap up or hurry. You simply sit for a few more moments, savoring the last of the stillness, and then you push yourself slowly to your feet, using the boulder for support. Your body feels refreshed and loose, the tiredness that had settled into your limbs now replaced by a calm, steady energy, and you stretch your arms above your head, interlacing your fingers and pushing your palms toward the sky, feeling the pleasant pull of muscles that have been resting. You collect the leather water bottle from the ground and take one more sip, the water now warm but still wet, and you tuck the folded linen cloth more securely into your waistband. The path back to the tomb is only a few dozen paces, and you walk it slowly, your sandals crunching softly on the loose pebbles, the sun warm on your left shoulder now that it has moved past its zenith. The entrance of the tomb is still ajar, the dark gap between the wooden door and the stone frame looking cool and inviting, and you push the door open a little wider to let in more of the afternoon light before stepping inside. The air that greets you is noticeably cooler than the air outside, a dry, still coolness that smells of lamp oil and gypsum, and the faint mineral tang of ground pigment, and you breathe it in with a quiet appreciation, feeling it settle against your sun-warmed skin like a gentle hand. Inside the tomb, nothing has changed. The lamps still burn in their niches, their flames steady and small, and the half-painted figure of Osiris still waits on the wall, its green face serene, its white shroud bright in the lamplight, its yellow throne glowing softly. The palette rests where you left it, the mounds of paint slightly drier on their surfaces, but still workable beneath, and your brush lies across the rinsing bowl, its tip still clean. You walk through the chamber once, slowly, letting your eyes readjust to the dimness, and you check the walls and the tools with the same calm, methodical attention that you have given them all day. Everything is in order, everything is as it should be, and you take your place before the panel, picking up the brush and dipping it into the rinsing water to moisten the tip. The rest has done its quiet work, and you feel ready to continue, the afternoon stretching before you like a calm, unbroken road that leads steadily toward the evening. You touch the brush to the green paint, and you begin again, the rhythm of the work resuming as naturally as the tide returns to the shore. The final details of the painted figure are the smallest and most precise of all, the tiny touches that transform a flat field of color into a sacred image of eternal presence, and you approach them with the same patient attention that you have given to every other stage of the work, the brush held lightly in your fingers, your face close to the wall. The eye of Osiris, that large almond-shaped eye that gazes out from the green face with serene, unblinking calm, still lacks its pupil and the thin black line that will give it definition and life. You select your very finest brush, the one with the single sharp point, and you dip it into the pool of dense black paint on your palette, drawing the tip through the glossy paste until it holds just enough color for a single stroke. The black is so dark that it seems to absorb the lamplight, a small void of color on the pale terracotta of the potsherd, and you carry it carefully to the wall, steadying your hand by resting your little finger against the dry plaster. You touch the brush to the center of the eye and paint a small, precise circle, the pupil, and then you draw the fine black outline that traces the upper and lower lids, extending the line slightly at the outer corner to create the formal, cosmetic taper that is proper to the divine. The line flows from the brush in a smooth, unbroken curve, and when it is done the eye seems to awaken, its flat green surface now focused and present, a living point within the stillness of the god. You clean the fine brush in the rinsing water and set it aside to dry, then turn your attention to the crook and flail, the two sacred implements that the god holds crossed over his chest. The crook, that curved shepherd's staff, requires a small highlight of white along its upper edge, a thin line that suggests the gleam of polished wood under a light that never changes. You mix a tiny amount of the thick white paint with a single drop of water to thin it to a flowing consistency, and you paint the highlight with a fine brush, a single, delicate stroke that follows the curve of the crook from the fist to the hooked end. The line so thin that it is barely visible from a step away, but adds a subtle, three-dimensional presence to the flat shape. The flail, with its three pendant strands, receives a similar highlight along the handle, a straight faint line of white that runs from the grip to the point where the strands begin, and then you add a tiny dot of red at the tip of each strand, a bead-like detail that completes the implement. These small touches are the final notes of a long, slow melody, the last brushstrokes that bring the painting to its proper completion. You step back from the wall and let your eyes travel across the entire register, from the red border at the top to the red border at the bottom, from the blue background of the inscription to the yellow throne, from the white shroud to the green face with its newly awakened eye. The figure of Osiris sits in his eternal calm, his colors bright and clean against the whitewashed plaster, his outlines crisp and unbroken, his proportions true to the ancient canon. The work is finished, not dramatically or suddenly, but gradually, the way the day itself has been finishing, moment by moment, stroke by stroke, until there is nothing left to add and nothing left to correct. You feel a quiet, settled satisfaction, a sense of completion that is entirely calm and without celebration, and you lower the brush to your side, letting your arm rest for the first time in many hours. The cleaning of the tools is a ritual as old as the painting itself, a sequence of small, methodical tasks that returns each object to its proper state and prepares it for the next day's work. You begin with the brushes, gathering them from their various resting places around the workspace and you rinse them one by one in the bowl of clean water, swirling the tips until the water clouds with color and then runs clear. The widest brush releases a pale bloom of white. The medium brush gives up a soft cloud of green, and the fine brushes let go of tiny threads of red and black and blue that drift and dissolve like smoke. You wipe each brush gently on a clean cloth, reshaping the tips with your fingers, and you lay them out on a dry piece of linen to finish drying in the air of the tomb. The finest brush, the one with a single sharp point, you return to its protective reed tube, sliding it in carefully so that the tip does not touch the sides, and you set the tube among the other tools. The palette requires its own careful attention. The mounds of paint that you did not use have begun to dry on their surfaces, forming thin, rubbery skins that seal the still soft paste beneath, and you scrape these skins away with the edge of the ivory spatula, collecting the remaining fresh paint into small, tight piles. Each color is transferred to a tiny linen packet that you fold and tie with a short length of string. The packets labeled by color and placed in a cool corner of the tomb where they will remain workable for several more days. The palette itself, the large potsherd, you scrub clean with sand and a little water, rubbing the surface with a flat stone until all traces of pigment are gone, and the terracotta shows its natural, warm orange-brown. You rinse the palette and set it against the wall to dry, its surface now ready to receive the next day's colors. The grinding slab and the handstone receive the same thorough cleaning, scrubbed with sand and water until the diorite gleams, a dull, dark gray, free of every grain of red ochre and yellow limonite. You dry them with a cloth and wrap the slab in its leather cover, setting it on the flat rock where it will wait. The bowls and dishes that held the gum solution, the egg tempera, and the rinsing water are all washed and dried, stacked neatly beside the grinding slab. The remaining raw minerals, the chunks of hematite and limonite and the bag of gypsum powder, are returned to their stoppered pots, the linen plugs pressed firmly into the necks, and the pots are placed in a row on the low shelf that you have established near the entrance. Every dole is accounted for, every surface is clean, and the workspace gradually returns to the same orderly state it held when you arrived in the cool darkness of the morning. You now turn your attention to the lamps, which have burned steadily all day and are now beginning to gutter slightly as the oil runs low. You top up the oil in each lamp from your clay bottle, the liquid glugging softly as it pours, and you adjust the wicks with a splinter of reed until the flames are steady and bright once more. One lamp you will leave burning in its niche, a small constant light that will welcome you when you return in the morning and that will keep the painted figures company through the long, silent night. The other lamp you will take with you to light your way through the gathering dusk as you walk back to the village. You pour a few extra drops of oil into this lamp's bowl, ensuring that the flame will last for the duration of the walk, and you set it near the door while you gather your bag. The linen sack that you carried in the morning now receives its contents once more. The rat-grinding slab, the handstone, the clean palette, the bundle of dried brushes, the ivory spatula, the remaining pots of raw mineral that you will need to replenish from your stores at home, the empty dishes and bowls that you will wash again in the village, and the few personal items that you brought with you. Each object goes into the bag in its proper order. The heavier items at the bottom, the delicate brushes at the top, and you draw the straps tight and test the weight on your shoulder. The bag is slightly lighter than it was at dawn, the raw hematite having been transformed into paint and left on the wall, and the difference is a quiet measure of the day's work. Before you leave, you make one final circuit of the chamber, carrying the lamp that you will take with you. You walk slowly along the left wall, the light moving over the painted scenes of offering and procession, and you pause before the panel where you worked today, the completed figure of Osiris sitting in his frame of red borders. The paint is dry to the touch, the colors settled and matte, and the god gazes out with his single, black-pupiled eye into the darkness that will hold him for all the centuries to come. You look at the blank panel beside him, the smooth white plaster that will be tomorrow's work, and you feel no impatience to begin, only a calm acknowledgement that the cycle will continue. The same tools and the same hands and the same slow, steady rhythm, repeating itself as long as the tomb requires. You lift the lamp and continue your circuit, checking the other walls, the other half-finished figures that wait in their various stages, and you satisfy yourself that everything is in order, that no tool has been left out of place, that the tomb is secure and ready for the night. At the entrance, you pause and turn back for a final look. The single lamp that you are leaving behind burns in its niche, a small steady star of orange light that illuminates the first chamber and sends soft, wavering shadows across the painted walls. Beyond it, the deeper chambers are dark, their secrets held in perfect blackness, and the silence of the tomb is complete, a silence that has been accumulating since the first stone was cut and that will persist long after the last painter has set down his brush. You breathe in the cool, dry air one more time, the scent of gypsum and lamp oil and ancient stone, and then you step through the doorway and into the late afternoon light of the valley. The sun has descended well past its zenith, and now hangs above the western cliffs, a golden disk that has softened from the harsh white of midday to a warm amber glow. The shadows, which were short and sharp when you took your midday rest, have lengthened across the canyon floor, stretching eastward in long blue-gray fingers that reach toward the path. The heat of the day is beginning to ease, the air still warm but no longer heavy, and a faint breeze has risen, moving through the canyon with a soft, sighing sound that stirs the dust and carries the distant, dry fragrance of the open desert. You set your bag down for a moment and close the wooden door, drawing it firmly against the stone frame and securing the simple rope that holds it shut, tying the knot with the same habitual, unhurried motion that you have used every evening. The tomb is sealed, the work is done, and the walk home lies ahead. You lift your bag onto your shoulder and take the lamp in your free hand, the flame burning bright and steady now that it is away from the sheltered air of the tomb. The path back through the canyon is the same path you walked in the starlight of the early morning, but it is transformed by the late afternoon light. The limestone cliffs glow with a warm golden color, their weathered surfaces catching the slanting sun and radiating a soft amber luminescence that makes the rock seem almost alive. The fallen boulders and the scattered thorn bushes cast long, elegant shadows that stretch across the track, and you walk through alternating bands of light and shade, your sandals making the same soft, scuffing sound that they have made all day. The lamp in your hand is not really needed yet, the daylight's still strong enough to see by, but you carry it anyway, its flame a small familiar companion that bobs gently with your steps. As you walk, the canyon walls begin to widen, and the track emerges from the narrow defile into the broader valley that opens toward the cultivation. Here the view expands, and you can see the western sky in its full, late afternoon glory. The sun has now touched the rim of the distant hills, and the sky around it is streaked with soft bands of rose and pale gold, the colors deepening moment by moment as the disk sinks lower. A few high, thin clouds have appeared, and they catch the sunset light, turning from white to pink to a delicate fading peach that seems to glow from within. The beauty of the sky is quiet and transient, a slow, gentle spectacle that asks for no audience, and you watch it as you walk, your pace unchanged, your mind calm and uncluttered by the events of the day. The path descends gradually toward the village, the pale ribbon of trodden earth winding between low mounds of rubble and out onto the open plain, where the desert gives way to the first fields of the cultivation. The air here is different, carrying the faint green smell of growing things, of irrigation water and wet earth, and the distant sweetness of blooming acacia. You pass a small canal that runs along the edge of the first field, its water dark and slow, reflecting the colors of the sunset sky in a long, rippling mirror that shatters into fragments of gold and rose and then reforms over and over as the current moves. The sound of the water is a soft, liquid murmur, a gentle, continuous note that blends with the rustle of the breeze in the palm fronds and the distant, fading calls of birds settling into their roosts. By the time you reach the outskirts of the workman's village, the sun has slipped below the horizon, and the sky has deepened from rose to a soft, violet gray that darkens toward the east, where the first stars are beginning to appear. The houses of dear el-Medina stand in their close rows, their mud-brick walls warm and dark against the fading light, and thin plumes of smoke rise from a few rooftops where the evening fires are being lit. You walk through the narrow, dusty streets, passing the familiar doorways and the small walled courtyards where dogs lie sleeping and chickens scratch at the last of the daylight, and you nod once to a neighbor who is sitting on his doorstep, a quiet, wordless greeting that requires no response. The village is peaceful, settling into its evening rhythm, and the sounds of quiet conversation and the clink of pottery drift from the open windows, soft and muted. You reach your own house, the small mud-brick dwelling with the low wooden door and the single high window, and you push the door open, stepping into the cool, dark interior. The air inside smells of coldest and dray straw and the faint, lingering scent of the barley bread you ate in the morning, a familiar, homely smell that welcomes you without words. You set your bag down beside the door, placing the lamp on the low shelf where it can safely burn while you settle in, and you untie your sandals, stepping out of them with a sigh of relief, feeling the packed earth floor cool against the soles of your feet. You pour a small amount of water from the clay jar into a bowl and wash your face and hands, the water cool and refreshing, removing the last traces of dust and pigment that have clung to your skin through the long day. You eat a simple evening meal, more barley bread and a few dried dates, sitting on your sleeping mat with your back against the wall, the lamp flame dancing gently on its wick beside you. The house is quiet, the only sounds the faint crackle of the lamp and the distant rhythmic chirping of crickets from the fields beyond the village. You think, with a drifting, unhurried mind, of the day that has passed, the walk in the starlight, the grinding of the red ochre, the mixing of the binders, the careful outlining and the patient filling of color, the rest in the shadow of the boulder, the final precise details of the divine eye. Each moment was ordinary, each task repeated 1,000 times before, and yet together they have formed a complete quiet whole, a day of work that has added one more figure to the walls of the eternal house. When the lamp burns low and your eyes grow heavy, you stretch out on your sleeping mat, pulling a light linen cloth over your body, and you let your head rest on the small padded headrest that has supported you through countless nights. The room around you is dim, the last flickers of the lamp casting soft, wavering shadows on the ceiling, and the silence of the village settles over you like a gentle hand. You close your eyes and your breathing slows, and your thoughts dissolve into the peaceful darkness. The day's work complete, the tools clean and waiting, the painted god keeping his silent vigil in the tomb beneath the mountain. Tomorrow you will wake in the cool darkness before dawn, eat a small piece of bread, gather your bag, and walk the same path under the same stars, and you will begin again, grinding the ochre, mixing the paint, tracing the outlines, filling the forms, one quiet day after another, as steady and patient as the stone itself.